Welcome to Epg Patishala. My name is Dugirala Vasanta. I am on the teaching faculty of the Department of Linguistics at Osmania University, Hyderabad. Today's lecture relates to course 10, module 30, the very last module of neurolinguistics, which is part of Psycho-neurolinguistics course. And I will be talking about neurolinguistics of bilingualism. The main objective of this lecture, to appreciate this, I want to say that we need to move away from knowledge base that is available in neurolinguistics today based on monolingualism or even bilingualism that is prevalent in the West, which is very different from the bi and the multilingualism that is there in our country. So, the main idea or the main purpose of this lecture is to discuss select cross-linguistic findings, so in relation to different aphasic syndromes, so which by drawing on languages which are very different from English are giving us new insights about brain-language relationships which monolingual knowledge base was not able to explain. So, in the e-text connected to this module, I have listed a whole lot of research priorities in the context of India, which I am not going to repeat in this lecture. I suggest you go back to the e-text to look at those research that is particular to our country, that we need to pay attention. In fact, I engaged with this module and this topic because I wanted to identify certain research priorities for our country. So, you look at the list of research topics in the e-text. Let me start with saying some key points about neurolinguistics of bilingualism in relation to the West, especially US, because in Europe the multilingualism is slightly somewhat different from the US. Much discussion coming from the West and especially in the North American context, it surrounds the following notions. One is, what are all the various kinds of bilingualism? Okay, is it coordinate or is it subordinate or is it sequential or is it simultaneous or whatever, or recovery patterns. How do aphasic patients recover? Alright, or even localization and lateralization of language functions in bilinguals, or impact of bilingualism on assessment and rehabilitation issues. So, these are the only topics neurolinguistic research dealt with which is coming from the West. The underlying assumption of much of this research is that there is always one native language and it can be called L1, alright, and you go on to learn a second language very often through instruction, and that second language is never used as much as the first language. In other words, that the second language L2 is restricted to certain domains. Okay, these assumptions cannot be generalized to our country is what I am trying to press in this lecture, because in India, as all of you are aware, bilingualism is not sequential. It's not that all of us have one mother tongue and at the age of 15 or 20 we go and learn another language, a foreign language in a classroom. It's not at all sequential. It is simultaneous and it is societal. It is supported by the governments. Example, 3-language formula in schools. The moment we go to school at the age of 5 or 6, we have to learn English, we learn Hindi, we learn our language, state language, we learn 3 languages. So, state supported. It is neighborhood bilingualism. We speak one language inside the house. The moment we go to play in the playground, we have other friends speaking other languages. So, it's a neighborhood bilingualism. It's a grassroots bilingualism. What I mean by that term is, and it's not my term, several social linguists in the Indian context have talked about grassroots bilingualism. That is, you don't have to be highly literate to know 2 or 3 languages. Even the semi-literates and the illiterates in our country use 2 or 3 languages. They may not write, but they use. Alright. So that's why it is grassroots bilingualism. Alright. So there is no question of clear-cut L1. Native language does not always dominate our use in different domains. Alright. The more and more educated you are, English is dominating. Most of the time we are getting away speaking English. Where are we switching to our own languages? How many of us read newspapers every day in Indian languages? Right? You have to think about all that. So you can't have L1 and L2 clearly demarcated like the way they do it in the West. So these are some of the facts that also apply to aphasic patients. It not only apply to normal people. Even after brain damage, the same facts you have to contend with. So neurolinguistics of bilingualism in India is different, and we need to understand how to characterize that. So how does cross-linguistic research help? And first of all, one of the first things people engaged with when they wanted to look at aphasic patients speaking different languages is to take on a functional perspective on language processing. Again, this is connected to the rise of connectionism, the rise of online tests. All these influenced people to say that it is not enough to simply talk about a language as though it's one complete object. Alright. One of the early studies which I like to quote as an example of an excellent cross-linguistic research which gave us new insights about aphasia is that of Bates and Wulfeck in 1989. They studied aphasic patients speaking English, Italian, Spanish, Hungarian, Serbo-Croatian, German, Turkish and Chinese. Look at the variety of languages and then they put forward two notions which are very central to the connectionist models. One notion is called cue validity, that is saliency or importance of a particular grammatical form. Let's say word order. Word order, how important is word order in any of these languages? Alright. So cue validity, how valid it is, how important it is in a given language is cue validity. Then cue cost. Cue cost is processing demands associated with that particular cue. Suppose you are taking word order. If word order is varied, is your processing affected? Are you able to process the meaning of a sentence much better in one particular word order but not in another order? So what is the cost of that cue in language processing? So these are the two concepts these researchers have used and raised the following questions. They said whether they wanted to know whether highly valid grammatical cues are more resistant to brain damage. Okay. First of all, we need to determine which cue is more important for which language. Once you determine that, is it possible that that cue is not going to be lost after brain damage, after you had a stroke? They wanted to know. Second question is whether relatively uninformative cue, that is, it's not salient, it's not important. Okay. Is that, uninformative grammatical element, is it vulnerable or less vulnerable? Is it more vulnerable or less vulnerable? So both questions, they're related, but they wanted to find out about this. So what they took a whole lot of patients with agrammatism, and they said, when you observe agrammatism, the way it manifests across these various languages, the definition that all the agrammatic speakers use telegraphic speech is wrong. It's not true. If you talk about English, yes, telegraphic speech. But if you go beyond English into other languages, it manifests differently. Also, what they noted is the substitution errors that the agrammatics show. Not only agrammatics, the substitution errors noted in so-called fluent and non-fluent aphasics are very similar in richly inflected languages. Please remember, many of our Indian languages are richly inflected. The noun agrees with the verb, right? So, in such languages, it's very difficult to say these substitutions are part of fluent aphasia, these are part of non-fluent aphasia. So those categories themselves have to be questioned. Then they also noticed that non-canonical sentence types are more vulnerable to brain damage. So every language has, like say some of our languages are considered word order languages. That is, we can have the verb in the final position or verb in the middle position, it doesn't matter. But it's not quite like that. There is always a canonical sentence structure which is more frequent, it is more often used and easy to process or interpret meanings or whatever. So, non-canonical structures, if something is not frequently used, something is not more common, then it is those rare ones which are vulnerable to brain damage. Now, the other factor, when you want to make use of a functional perspective on aphasia and examine patients who are coming from multilingual contexts like India, is the notion of code switching and code mixing. Even aphasic patients might switch codes and might mix 2 or 3 different languages. So we need to engage with different methodological tools to understand code switching and code mixing, which was not given that much of importance in the West. Let me now discuss another study close at home. It's undertaken by Josna Vaid and Rama Pandit in 1991. They conducted studies on Hindi and English bilingual, non-damaged, non-brain damaged ordinary normal people as well as Broca's aphasics. 2 groups, okay, and they engaged with a cue called animacy, alright, and that is noun-verb agreement and word order. So they engaged with three major cues: animacy, noun-verb agreement and word order. They wanted to know how these cues enable non-brain damaged normal people, normal adults as well as Broca's aphasics to interpret the function of different constituents in a sentence containing 2 nouns. Okay, so they used 54 test sentences by changing these variables. All right. So please go back to the e-text where I have described in greater length how they created these sentences, or even their original article is available on the net. So you can read that if you want more details about this particular study. But their main findings are that animacy was the dominant cue in Hindi, whereas word order is more important for English. See, already different cues help you process the meaning of sentences depending on which language you are using. Alright, animacy dominated sentence interpretation in Hindi, English, bilingual in both non-brain damaged as well as brain damaged adults. Hindi, English, bilingual Broca's aphasics exhibited a preference for noun animacy in Hindi but not in English. So, if you are a bilingual aphasic, you are making use of certain language specific cues to understand the meaning of sentences depending on which language you are processing. In English, they did rely to some extent on word order, maybe not to the same extent as native speakers, but they are able to benefit from language specific cues. Now, what I mean by a particular cue being important, the picture shown to you on the screen next, it doesn't relate to the study I described to you, but I put this picture just to draw your attention to the fact when researchers wanted to know how important word order is for English users, Italian users and German users, look at this graph. In understanding the meaning of sentences where there are 2 nouns, one is a subject performing a certain action on another object, that is transitive verb is there, and there is another this thing. So, if you ask them who's doing what on whom, in order to interpret the meaning of such sentences, look at the graph. English users rely so much on word order. Look where the red line is going. Whereas Italian and German speakers are not relying as much as English speakers. This is what I mean by saliency. different grammatical categories contribute differently to your understanding of meaning of sentences. Coming back to Vaid and Pandit's study, they could have interpreted, their results saying that semantically ambiguous sentences in English word order helped more than animacy, and it is the other way around in Hindi in both groups, right? The authors basically commented that Broca's aphasics, for Broca's aphasics, animacy might be serving a non-linguistic cue. Alright. It also appears that some language specific information is impervious to the effects of brain damage. That is resistant. More research is needed to study how languages are mixed by aphasics in our context. Alright. In cross-linguistic research, the second major topic that engage researchers is that especially the research that took place on monolinguals, they said in aphasiology, they noted consistently that verbs are more vulnerable to brain damage than nouns. Alright. Now, when you take this idea and you apply it in our context, in the Indian context where we are using 2 or 3 languages, can we simply conclude that verbs are more polysemous and therefore they are vulnerable to brain damage and nouns are not. Venkatesh et al. Study, I have discussed in the e-text in greater detail, but I would like to raise a couple of points here. Venkatesh et al. Studied Hindi-English users, again both non-brain damaged as well as aphasics, and they asked them to both produce as well as judge sentences in both these languages. And because they didn't want to conclude that it is verb polysemy which makes verbs more difficult. Is that true of Hindi is what they wanted to know. So what they did was, in aphasics, the production errors did not mirror judgment errors. Alright. But both groups, non-brain damaged as well as patients, performed better in Hindi than in English. They noticed that the performance is in general better in Hindi than English. Alright. So, based on this study, the authors concluded that it is the syntax of causative verbs and the meanings attached to these verbs in Hindi influence the performance of both groups. So, what is the implication of this Venkatesh et al. Study? It's saying that when there is aphasia, language assessment cannot be performed in one language and extend the results to other language. You may have to do tests in both languages separately with very carefully designed sentence material. Okay. There's another study Venkatesh et al. Reported, 2011 study, in which they administered bilingual aphasia test, which is what is used in bilingual studies, a very famous test by, developed in the 80s, and it's available in Tamil, Hindi and some of our Indian languages also. So, they administered it on 2 patients. Both were diagnosed with, they're multilingual and they're diagnosed with transcortical aphasia, and both patients did very well in lexical decision task of the BAT test. BAT is bilingual aphasia test, but they had tremendous difficulty in syntactic comprehension. So, one way of looking at it is their lexical processing is not impaired and syntactic processing is impaired. But these authors didn't want to jump to that conclusion. Instead, what they said is, we must look at closely at the syntax, how syntax works in Hindi, that there are overt case markers in Hindi which assign participant roles differently, which make it more transparent. Hindi sentences can be understood more easily than English sentences because Hindi sentences have case markers which tell us who is doing what on whom much more easily than English. Alright. You look at the data I have quoted on the screen. I have printed the English and Hindi, Hindi sentences with English glosses. Not being a native speaker of Hindi, I may not be pronouncing them correctly, but when you say ladka ladki se dhakka kha raha, alright, I believe it means the boy is being pushed by the girl. Ladka ladki se. The moment you hear say, your brain interprets the meaning quickly. That say is giving you who's doing what, who's pushing whom. Alright. When you say the boy is being pushed by the girl, the kind of processing you have to engage, who's pushing whom? Is the boy pushing the girl, girl pushing the boy? Both are possible. So you take a little longer. There is no cue here. Whereas Hindi is giving you a cue. That's what they are trying to say. Look at one more sentence. वो कुत्ता है जो बिल्ली को काटा रहा. Look at the bold of Joe and Co. Those markers which are printed in bold font are giving you cues to say it is the dog that is biting the cat, not the other way. Alright. So the point that is being made here is that different languages have different structures, giving some cues to the brain and helping process. They help in processing the meaning of the sentences differently. So, since bilingual aphasia test is available in some of the Indian languages like Tamil and Kannada and Hindi and all that, I think more research should take place. First of all, we need to also look at this test, how it is designed. It has 3 sections. In section 1, they ask detailed questions about language use history, which is very important. So, in this module, which is about the neurolinguistics of multilingualism, one point you must keep in mind is you must have a questionnaire and get data about which language is used in which domain using a questionnaire. Second section is about what is the nature of loss. Is it at the phonological level or is it at different are they having more difficulty reading or writing or understanding or speaking sentences? So you have to use certain online tests or whatever it is to test the patterns of language disturbance. Third section is very important. Again, in this context, you have to have items which allow the participant, whether it is patient or non-brain damaged participant, to judge translation equivalence. You give a word and say, is this the equivalent of this word? You have 2 words. Are they both equivalent? Are they conveying equivalent meaning? You have to ask such things in, say, suppose Hindi and English. Alright. So that is the component which must be used. I have given a website. Please go on to this website. I think BAT test, some description about BAT test is available from this website. Read more about it. Try to design more tests in relation to Indian languages. So, coming towards the end of my lecture, the question that we need to ask ourselves on this topic is, does brain damage affect control and not representations in bilinguals? Because there is a proposal made by one researcher called Abu Talebi in 2008, where he argued that the cortical network involved in learning first language relies on procedural memory and it adapts to accommodate the second language. So you have procedural memory in one part of the brain. It is involved in learning first language naturally. You have declarative memory in another part of the brain. It helps us learning second language somewhat differently. But when there is a brain damage, the L1 network can adapt L2 into it. Especially when you become proficient L2 user, the areas may collapse. There may be overlap of the cortical networks for both L1 and L2. Alright. So, in individuals with bi and multilingualism, there are a number of ways a particular task can be performed. To understand the nature of adapted network, we need to apply variety of both online and offline measures of language. That is the final thing I wanted to say. Now, if you move from aphasia to dyslexia, of Hindi English bilinguals, the picture becomes extremely complex, because English makes use of the alphabetic system of writing system, and Hindi's Devanagari is semi-syllabic, that is, it draws some principles of alphabetic system and some from syllabic system. So the question of irregular words is very important for English. It is not very important for Hindi, and therefore the question of surface dyslexia may be there in English, but what sense can we make of surface dyslexia in Hindi? I am not sure. So when you have biscriptal, bilingual, Hindi, English, aphasics, how do we test them? Alright. So English based models of reading I have discussed in reading and writing modules. Go back and read that. They pay more attention to obligatory influence of phonology, because in English you pay attention to individual letters and you convert the graphemes into phonemes. So phonology root is very important. But the script associated with Indian languages, they are more transparent than English. So maybe we grasp the whole word together, or we may pay attention to morphology. So we need to develop new models of reading and writing before we can talk about how dyslexia manifests in multilingual individuals. So lastly, I have discussed the one case study of Alzheimer's dementia patient, Hindi English. Please go and read the e-text to know who this patient is. But this patient was shown this picture, which is I am showing you on the screen. The picture is a standard, I think Western aphasia battery and other standardized aphasia tests use this. It's called cookie theft picture. There's a woman washing dishes. Two children are trying to steal cookies from the cabinet, which is very high. So they climbed the stool, and the stool is tilted. So patient is asked to describe this picture. This particular patient, whom a neurologist studied, who kindly shared this data with me, a practicing neurologist from Indore, Dr. Apur Paranik gave me this data. This patient, in English he said, he's a boy, she's sister, this is a top place, sitting on the side, he's trying to take something. Is par chadke. Suddenly English is switched to Hindi. Is par chadke, by climbing upon it. When he is asked to describe the same picture in Hindi, he said, हाथ में लेकर चढ़ रही है, उसके हाथ में है कुछ चीज रखने के लिए, खाने का है, और वो लेकर इधर आ गई है. So how do we interpret this response from the patient? Is this patient more fluent in Hindi than English? It appears so. But his mother tongue is Marathi. He was tested in Hindi and English because there are no test material in Marathi. His name is used as PM. He lived all his life in Hindi speaking state, but English was the language of choice in his professional occupational life. He didn't perform well, maybe because the stimuli were not familiar to him, maybe. So I'm posing this, I'm ending this lecture with this patient, because to make the point that we need to develop tasks in our languages, tasks which are sensitive to our context, and we need to focus on language mixing. Look at how this man shifted suddenly from English to Hindi. So language mixing, language switching strategies, what strategies do brain damage patients use? We need to focus, develop tests which are sensitive to those aspects. That brings me to the last part of my lecture, the summary. To summarize this lecture, Indian multilingualism is very different from that of the West. It is societal, it is grassroots, it is simultaneous, and it is characterized by code switching and code mixing. To understand the impact of multilingualism on brain damage, we need to engage with these specific aspects of Indian multilingualism in developing new tests, as well as in understanding the relation, how brain is managing these various languages, how after the brain damage the reorganization takes place in aphasic patients, and which cues are very salient, important in which language. Does that saliency affects the recovery pattern, and does that knowledge tell us which language to work with in rehabilitation? All these are connected, and therefore we need to delineate both structural and functional differences in languages and scripts associated with our languages to develop new models. And without such culture-specific, language-specific models, there is no way we can characterize dyslexia and dysgraphia or dementia in the Indian context. And I ended the lecture by citing one patient PM whose mother tongue is Marathi, but he is forced to use English. He is highly educated, but he was tested in Hindi because only Hindi test was available and English test is available. He could not be tested in Marathi. So what sense can we make of this patient's breakdown? And this patient is representative of many patients across India in neurology clinics. And to talk about the bilingualism or multilingualism in neurolinguistics, we have to do a lot of work to make sense of the language breakdown in patients like PM. And that's where I would like to end the lecture. And again, I suggest, I repeat that you must go back to the e-text and additional readings to understand neurolinguistics of bilingualism in the Indian context, because I have cited more research studies from our context in the e-text than I was able to talk in this lecture. Thank you.